First Republic is no more. Regulators seized the embattled lender overnight and sold it to J.P. Morgan Chase, what is now America's second biggest bank failure after the 2008 collapse of Washington Mutual, means that 84 bank branches that closed as First Republic locations on Friday reopened today as J.P. Morgan Chase branches. Hundreds of Texas officers are looking for the gunman accused of killing 5 people after a dispute between neighbors. The suspect went on a rampage with an AR-15 style rifle Friday at his neighbor's home after being asked to stop shooting in his yard while their baby slept. The youngest killed was a 9-year-old boy. There were 10 people, all family, inside the home, and luckily 5 survived. It's the latest in a series of recent retaliatory shootings. Yesterday, Senator Tim Scott, a Republican from South Carolina, said he will make a major announcement in Charleston on May 22nd, weeks after he launched an exploratory committee for a presidential bid. Scott, the first Black senator from South Carolina and the only Black Republican senator, could become the second GOP candidate from the state in the 2024 race. Former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley announced her candidacy last month. A state representative in Montana asked a court on Monday to allow her to return to the House floor for the rest of the state's legislative session, arguing that her First Amendment rights had been violated after an escalating standoff over her remarks on transgender issues. Representative Zoe Zephyr, a Democrat from Montana, was barred last week from participating in deliberations in the House chamber after she made impassioned comments in opposition to a ban on hormone treatments and surgical care for transgender minors. The bill, which passed, has since been signed by the governor. The Met Gala, the fashion world's annual extravaganza, is happening tonight, a star-studded event in New York that raises money for the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute. It's organized each year by Vogue editor-in-chief Anna Wintour. And this year's theme is not based on a concept, but rather an individual. That's designer Karl Lagerfeld, who died in 2019, but who is remembered and well known for transforming Chanel. Comedian and Daily Show correspondent Roy Wood hosted Saturday night's White House Correspondent Dinner, but Roy wasn't the only one with jokes. Joe Biden took to the mic with his own brand of humor and landed this one. This is what the president had to say. It's great. The cable news networks are here tonight. MSNBC, owned by NBC Universal. Fox News, owned by Dominion Voting Systems. The president got a big chuckle and laugh from the audience. Then he went on to say, last year, your favorite Fox News reporters were able to attend because they were fully vaccinated and boosted. This year, with that $787 million settlement, they're here because they couldn't say no to a free meal. Yes, Joe Biden has jokes. This is Areva Martin in real time, and I'm your host, Areva Martin. This is your one-stop destination for today's trending news, expert analysis, and my unfiltered opinions. This is the second hour, and we're talking all about, you guessed it, former President Donald Trump and his latest legal trial that's happening in a federal court in Manhattan. This is a civil trial, not a criminal trial. So no matter what happens, you will not see Donald Trump in an orange jumpsuit. But if the plaintiff in this case, E Jean Carroll, is successful, you may see the president hit with a large monetary damage award. E Jean Carroll has sued Donald Trump for defamation and sexual assault that she says occurred almost 30 years ago in a department store, this famous department store in New York called Bergdorf Goodman, she said Donald Trump basically forced her into a dressing room, pushed her up against a wall, and raped her in this dressing room. She didn't come forward for years, although she said she did tell 2 of her girlfriends at the time. They too are expected to take the witness stand. E Jean Carroll has been subjected to vile criticism online. She says every morning she wakes up, looks at her Twitter feed, looks at her social media, and the negative and hateful comments are plentiful. And also inside that courtroom, Donald Trump's lawyer went after her pretty aggressively in his cross-examination. challenging her credibility, suggesting that she filed this lawsuit for fame, for fortune, and for money. And most importantly, just to sell books. When we come forward, I have one of the nation's leading civil rights attorneys. She has represented women in sexual assault, sexual molestation cases for over 40 years. Most famously, she has represented Gretchen Carlson, who was an anchor at Fox. She's represented lots of women at Fox. We know of all the women who've come forward alleging sexual harassment at the Fox network. I'm so excited. She's just a fantastic lawyer, incredible advocate for women. And I'm just so happy that she'll be joining me. Her name is Nancy Erica Smith. And when we come forward, she's going to help us break down what's happening in the case of E Jean Carroll and what's up with this motion for a mistrial. Is this just Donald Trump's way to delay these proceedings, or is there some real teeth to his allegation that the judge is treating him unfairly? When we come forward, KBLA Talk 1580.
Have you visited us online for the grand?
Joined in this hour by Nancy Erica Smith. She is a civil rights attorney in New York City. She has represented women for over 4 decades in lawsuits, civil lawsuits involving sexual harassment, sexual assault, and cases very similar to the case that E Jean Carroll has filed against Donald Trump. And Nancy is here to help us make sense of what's happening in this case, particularly given this new motion for a mistrial filed by Donald Trump's legal team. Welcome, Nancy. Thank you so much for joining us. You have seen it all. Oh, thank you. You've seen it all. You've seen every trick in the book. What do you make of this motion for a mistrial and the allegations by Trump's team that somehow the judge is treating him unfairly?
Well, Donald Trump and his team are a one-note song. Bully everybody. Bully the victim, try to bully the judge, try to bully the media. That's really the only note they know. They only know intimidation and bullying. Luckily, I don't think this Judge Kaplan, is going to be intimidated or bullied, but I think that's the role. And also trying to set up an appeal, which also is downright silly. The appeals on a biased judge are almost never granted, and they almost never succeed. And the rulings in this case are not out of bounds. They're not at all out of bounds. He's only allowing 2 other victims of Donald Trump to testify because they had experienced a similar kind of attack as E Jean Carroll. He's allowed in the Access Hollywood tape, which is going to be great. I can't wait. But it's just more bullying. What do you do when you're losing? You try to stop the trial.
No, that's an excellent point. But let's step back, because a lot of people, I heard some people talking about this actually on an airplane. I was flying over the weekend, and someone was saying, oh my God, why would she file this lawsuit 30 years later? Why didn't she do this, when it happened? Help us understand why, women and maybe even some of your clients file these kinds of lawsuits, sexual harassment, sexual assault, years, in this case, a couple of decades after the incident has occurred.
Well, this case and the way she is being treated by Trump's lawyer is a primer on why women don't report rape. I mean, our society has so recognized that women are abused by every system, by the healthcare system, and by the law enforcement community, and by their families, and by their friends, and by their neighbors when they accuse somebody of rape. Often it's somebody they know. That's the most frequent kind of rape. Rape is the most unreported crime in the world. And it's because of the way women are treated. It's fairly recent, and it's not in every country in the world, that a husband was allowed to rape his wife. It wasn't illegal. So, I mean, we're plowing through centuries of misogyny and sexism to get here. But I saw an article in the New York Times today about a veteran of World War II who won a Purple Heart and many medals. And he was almost 100 years old before he would talk about the war. He just started telling his family and friends what happened in the war. And we all know this. This is a very frequent story that veterans of any war, all our wars, even our most recent incursions into Iraq and everywhere else where we create havoc and create violence, these veterans very frequently come home and refuse to talk about it. It's one way to deal with trauma. And they are lauded for their service. Can you imagine what it's like to be a woman and you're raped and it's somebody you know? And she describes all the feelings women usually have. Blame ourselves, feel ashamed, feel afraid. Now, after 5 years, she couldn't have sued because it was a 5-year statute of limitations. So when people say, you know, she sat around for 30 years, not really. She didn't want to do anything for 5 years, and Me Too hadn't happened. And the other thing that happened is New York changed its law in 2022 and because it recognized, the state of New York recognized that women have been mistreated by the law enforcement community, by the judiciary, by the medical establishment, and said, you can come forward now. And E. Jean Carroll described at trial, I think very well, that Me Too affected her. That, Gretchen Carlson was the first person because many women came out and said Roger Ailes, they broke NDAs and bravely came forward. 24 of them, Roger Ailes abused me too. Then we had the Cosby revelations, and then we had Weinstein. And
yeah,
women.
I'm so glad you brought that. I just want to know the part about the veteran. Such an important point. Because there are so many traumatic experiences that people have that they bury deep in the recesses of their brains, that they don't talk about, family trauma, and they're never criticized for it, and they're not rarely disbelieved. We saw that happen early on in the cases involving the boys who were molested by priests, but over time, people started to realize, no, these things really did happen. These little boys were really raped and abused by priests. But it's something about when a woman comes forward, as you said, to tell a story about being raped. Now, all of a sudden, there's this big credibility issue, right? Oh, my God, this can't be true, because if it's true, she would have talked about it that night. She would have ran to a police department. She would have had a rape kit, completed. She would have filed a report. But we don't say to the 100-year-old veteran, the day he experienced that trauma from being in the war, that he would have ran to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, he would have gotten mental health treatment, he would have done, this laundry list of things that we believe you should do when you experience trauma. So it isn't this unique, and it's important. I think I just want to highlight that women, and in particular, if you add on the top of that, women of color often are held to such a different standard when it comes to these kinds of allegations. And I don't think we can say that enough. And the kind of cross-examination. Let's talk about that in this trial. You surprised? I know Joe. You know Joe. I'm sure you know Joe Tacopino. He's a New Yorker, right? So in some ways that's his personality. He's kind of a tough guy, lawyer. But he's a nice guy. I like him. But he's going after E. Jean Carroll in a way I'm a little surprised by. One day I thought to text him. I said, no, I'll leave him alone. He's in trial. I'll hit him up after the trial is over. But there seemed to have been like a turn with these big cases you're talking about, Cosby and Weinstein, some of these other high-profile cases, where people understood that being that aggressive towards your victim in a trial, which was commonplace before these big cases, that wasn't cool anymore, that jurors were turned off by that. So are you kind of surprised by Joe's aggressive nature and going after E. Jean Carroll? Why didn't you scream? And, all these, like...
I'm really not, because he represents Donald Trump. I'm really not. Donald Trump knows one way of being with women, and it's abusive across the board. He's abusive. He says to this day, one of his social media posts was, the idea that I would take an almost 60-year-old woman is absurd. She was 52. His current wife is 53. He's 76, she's 79, but his whole thinking about women is so Neanderthal, so sexist, so misogynist, that he thinks it's cool to say something like that. And he's speaking to people who want to hear that kind of retro, sexist, racist. That's what they want to hear. So, yeah, I'm not surprised that Joe is taking Donald Trump's lead in being abusive to a victim of rape. And it's a fine line, too, because on some level, he's going after you weren't really damaged. And on the other hand, he's saying it didn't happen. So he's got a difficult road to hoe.
Well, yeah, you raise a good point. You're not going to be Donald Trump's lawyer unless you behave in that fashion. I mean, that's like, right? Mandatory to get hired by him. You have to have that persona, that really tough, aggressive persona to even be his lawyer, because he demands that out of the folks that represent him. But I was a little surprised by it, because we've seen, I mean, that didn't work out too well for some of these other guys who have been in trial. So, that's kind of the definition of, insanity, is to keep doing the same thing the same way, expecting a different result. But let's talk about legally. What do you think is the hardest part of this case? E Jean Carroll can't give the exact day. She can't pin down that detail, although she has lots of other, really vivid details about being on the elevator, the lingerie section of the department store, going into the dressing room. But what do you make of her not being able to pin down the exact day? Do you think that's going to hurt her case with jurors?
I have had so many clients that remember the trauma very specifically and don't remember the other things. And I think when I have that problem in front of a jury, I often say, when you drove here today, how many red lights did you pass? How many people did you walk in the elevator with today? I mean, things that happen that are not in your mind don't stick in your mind. Can you imagine? You're raped that day. What are you remembering about that day? She remembers the rape very, very clearly and the details. But then she really was very honest about trying to forget it. Really trying to, as women, particularly women of color, we're told, suck it up, be tough, get over it, don't whine. And she's a public person, so she feels the need to be positive. It's her persona. She's a little bit quirky, I have to say that. I like that, but she is a little quirky, and she's being who she is, and she's owning those things. I was really happy to see them open her direct on those things that, as a lawyer, I think you own your weaknesses. So the idea that she doesn't remember exactly the date but she has two fresh complaint witnesses who are going to testify. And I mean, fresh complaint that day, right after it happened. So I hope those are good witnesses. We'll see. It's not easy to remember something that happened in 1995. Not for me, anyway.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think they did do a good job of her owning what some may see as weaknesses in her case, and her not trying to embellish beyond that which she did remember. The facts that she did remember, she was, very clear. And she pushed back. I mean, what did you think of the way she pushed back on the cross-examination about, like, the screaming, and he would say, allegedly you were raped, and she would correct him and say, no, I was raped. Well, do you think that helps in a case like that, again, when you are the plaintiff, the all eyes on you in terms of that jury? How do they see that? How do they perceive that as a general rule when a plaintiff is, pushing back versus kind of being a shrinking violet? She did weep, I guess, during some of her testimony, but she was not just sitting there weeping the entire time.
I thought she was a really good witness. I like my witness to be very firm in what they know and what they don't know. If you don't know, say you don't know. If it's a weakness, own it and say why. But I love that she would push back at him and say, you're going to yell at me for not screaming. I mean, any woman knows that what happens next. You're shocked that somebody is raping you. What happens next? His hands go around your throat? I mean, we live in a different world than men live in. We live in a world where we're constantly having to evaluate whether we are going to experience violence or sexual violence or both. Mm-hmm. So the idea, in the old days, I'm sure it wasn't rape unless the woman issued a hue and a cry. You couldn't even allege it was rape if you couldn't prove that you screamed and tried to stop it, right? So she's thin, small woman, right? And you didn't make enough noise when you were being raped, and you didn't see anybody around. It's an absurd statement. It's so rooted in the misogyny that we still live with. But I like that she stood up for herself. I like that she takes him on. I think she's doing a really good job. And when I really liked the statement she made when he said, why come forward now? And she said, I was sick of staying silent. And I think that women all over the world, we've seen it, are sick of staying silent. We're sick of being silenced.
Yeah, obviously that scream comment is right out of that playbook, 20 years ago. Yes, if you were raped, there were, again, boxes you had to check to prove that you were raped. And screaming, is like box, letter A. And if you don't scream, oh my God, either you're enjoying it, right? Or you're consenting to it. Yep. Or it's not happening at all, because any respectable woman that's being raped would be so outraged that she would be screaming at the top of her lungs, and then the store attendants would run in, and there's this fairy book narrative about what rape looks like and what a woman should do. And that's why I think these trials are so important, because it is giving the American people an opportunity, there are no cameras in this courtroom, to really see how far we have come, but how far we need to go, because we've made so much progress. And, I haven't been doing this as long as you have, but I've been doing it long enough to know that there's a real difference, a real sea change that has happened. But these kinds of questions in this case show how much further we need to go. When we come forward, we're going to talk about the two percipient witnesses, this juror that has 6 men and 3 women, and this book that E Jean Carroll wrote and has to deal with in terms of the allegations that she is coming forward, because it was all a part of her plan to sell more books. Stay with us. KBLA Talk 1580.
This is a rather bold.
I'm back, and I'm joined by Nancy Erica Smith. She is a civil rights attorney and litigator who has been representing women in sexual harassment and sexual assault cases for over 4 decades. She represented Gretchen Carlson in her lawsuit against Fox and Roger Ailes, and has represented just a number of women who have filed sexual harassment and assault cases. We are talking about the E Jean Carroll sexual assault and defamation case against Donald Trump, which is moving forward in a Manhattan federal courthouse. It's a civil case again, so what's at stake are money damages, not a criminal conviction or jail time. But this is a significant case. This is the first time in the history of this country where a former president who is running for president has to stand trial and face allegations that he raped a woman in a department store. And as we were discussing, Nancy, this trial, we're not only going to hear from E Jean Carroll and her account of the rape, but the judge has said 2 other victims that had similar experiences with Donald Trump will be allowed to testify. And that Access Hollywood tape, which was revealed to the world just weeks before the 2016 presidential election, where we heard Donald Trump using that very offensive language about a woman, that will also be played. So talk to us some, Nancy, about who these 2 other women are that will be allowed to testify. What are they likely to say, and the impact of their testimony on this jury?
Well, one woman is was a People reporter, People magazine reporter, who went down to Mar-a-Lago to actually do a puff piece about Melania Trump. And she was taken into a room by him, and he did forcibly kiss her and try to fondle her, and she pushed him away. And the second happened to sit next to him many years ago on an airplane. And he attempted to kiss her, fondled her breasts, and tried to put his hand up her skirt. There are many, many other women who accuse Donald Trump of sexual assault. Many. I think we're in the 50s. But these are the 2 that the judge said are the most similar to what happened to E Jean Carroll, in that they barely knew him, and he used a similar tactic of scaring them, really, they weren't out having drinks at a bar type thing. It was very sudden, and it was very similar type of attack. I think that he's in trouble in light of they're not writing a book. They're not running for anything. They're not even public people, really. And their willingness to come forward, I think, is very, very powerful. At the Access Hollywood tape is pretty outrageous because he admits doing what he did. He admits when you're a star, they let you do it. And then he describes sexually assaulting women in the most crude terms you can because he's an incredibly crude misogynist. So I think it's going to be very powerful. I think it also might be quite powerful. What's supposed to happen tomorrow are the fresh complaint witnesses. One told her to go.
Before we get to that, Nancy, I want to ask you about the Access Hollywood. We'll get to those fresh complaint witnesses.
Sure.
But why do you think the judge let the Access Hollywood tape in?
Well, I mean, how often do you have somebody admit to the modus operandi? I think it goes like into the cases where you allow you've used the same behavior in the past to commit the same kind of crime. I think that's the only reason he let it in, is now you have somebody famously admitting to the very crime he's accused of committing. And I mean, civil crime.
Right.
So I think that's why it's let in, and it's going to be very powerful. I think it's also interesting that it's very unlikely that he will subject himself to cross-examination. And
yeah, he hasn't shown up yet to the courthouse. And I know the judge was pressing the attorney on whether he was going to show up. What did the attorney ultimately say?
I don't think he's ultimately given an answer yet. Every day the judge asks him because they want to make sure that security is ready. And he keeps saying, I don't know. He's still putting him off. There's still no firm answer to the question, is Donald Trump going to testify? I don't know whether that's a PR tactic or what, because I don't think there's a chance in hell. Do you? Can he?
Oh, no, I can't imagine him. He's not going to even show up because last time he was in New York, he got booed. The city that used to love Donald Trump now pretty much hates him. So I don't even see him showing up in the city. But what do you make? We're going to talk about those complaint witnesses, but have you had a case? Can he defend himself? Basically, he's going to, I assume he has some witnesses. I'm not sure who's on his witness list, but it seems like a big part of his defense is tear down the credibility of the plaintiff and the plaintiff's witnesses, because you're not going to have him there with the counter narrative saying, yes, I was either in that department store that day and it didn't happen, or I wasn't even in that department store. I was, across the country in California on the day, or this month or this year, whenever this might have happened. That's kind of a risky strategy for a defendant to not get up and say into the eyes of those jurors, I didn't do this. This didn't happen. So what do you make of this defense, which is basically, prove your case by tearing down the plaintiffs?
Right. I wouldn't want to be Joe Tacopina. I don't think that this is a winning strategy, but it's all he has. Because, and he's got to tear down not just E Jean Carroll, he's got to tear down two other victims of sexual assault by Donald Trump, and two just friends of E Jean Carroll's who she told about it at the time.
Let's talk about those witnesses. So there are two women who are going to come forward. You think that's going to happen tomorrow, Tuesday.
Yes.
And they're not precipient witnesses. That word typically means, I was there, I saw it when it happened, but they are fact witnesses because she told them immediately after it happened. What are we expecting from their testimony?
Well, I think fresh complaint witnesses are very important in rape cases because when women are afraid to come forward for all the reasons you and I have discussed, it helps that you have somebody who has no stake in the game to come forward and say, she told me. I've used that many times as an important way to say, here's some more evidence that this is what happened. Because usually during a sexual assault, there are just two people around. Right. So the interesting thing that I want to see is how Ms. Martin testifies. Ms. Birnbaum told E. Jean Carroll to go to the police. And Ms. Martin said, are you kidding? He's Donald Trump. He'll destroy you. I think that it's probably fair to say she regrets that advice, but we'll see. We'll see. I think that it's going to be also, I think Trump's lawyer, again, is in the unfortunate position of having to beat up on these women, and they aren't writing books. Like the two victims, the other victims, they have no stake in this I mean, he's going to say she's your friend. Does that mean you'll go into federal court or agree to, under the penalty of perjury, to lie because she's your friend? I doubt it. I don't think that's going to fly. But what else can they do? Because Donald Trump can never in his life get on a witness stand and subject himself to cross-examination. Not only is he a pathological liar, he can't formulate normal sentences. He can't.
Well, they're going to show, though, we know, Nancy, that he was deposed.
Yes.
And we know that Joe has told the court he plans to use portions of his deposition. So I guess there is going to be some deposition testimony read,
yes,
to the jurors, where Trump was asked under oath if he did it or what happened. And I'm presuming he said in the deposition, no, I didn't do it. We know he said some other ridiculous things during that deposition. But how powerful or how persuasive do you think deposition testimony read in a trial like this will be?
I don't think it's going to be that persuasive, because this jury has seen cross-examination that was extremely aggressive, and they're not stupid. I have great faith in democracy because I have tried jury trials for 40 years. And I really think that one thing we have in common is that everybody hates liars. People don't like being lied to. It feels insulting. So no matter what you think going into a courtroom about the world and Donald Trump, if somebody stands up, looks you in the eyes and lies to you, most people don't like that. So I don't think it's playing. I think they'll play the video, and then their only witness, as I understand it, is the psychiatrist, who's going to either say she's crazy or she's narcissistic, or, I don't know what the psychiatrist can possibly say. She's never got treatment. She did testify to that today. She hasn't been to therapists. Again, I'm 68, so I'm not that far away, but 79 is pushing the age where people didn't go to therapy. It wasn't as common. We didn't think of mental health. Again, you were supposed to be ashamed if you were traumatized, if you were depressed, if you had anxiety. You were supposed to be tough and tough it out and not whine, and certainly don't admit to having any kind of mental illness. So it'll be interesting to see what that therapist is going to say. I'm sure she's had the MMPI. You know what they do.
Right. When we come forward, I want to talk about these 6 men on the jury. What impact do you think they will have? And this book, and how jurors may see someone who's written a book and who's been publicly speaking out against their accuser, or accused, I should say, in this case, the accused and the defendant. Stay with us. KBLA Talk 1580.
Is the pen mightier than the sword?
Have you visited us online for the grand opening of
We're back with Nancy Erica Smith. We're talking about this E Jean Carroll trial. It's well underway, and we're expecting 2 witnesses to testify tomorrow who actually E Jean Carroll talked to right after the rape happened 30 years ago. They're going to have some powerful testimony. But Nancy, I want to ask you about this jury pool. I was got a little nervous when I saw that it had 6 men and 3 women. And we know in a federal civil trial, they've got to have a unanimous, outcome in order for there to be liability imposed on Donald Trump. What do you make of this jury with 6 men on it?
I was a little nervous when I saw 6 men and 3 women. I got to say, it makes me a little nervous. It may put some pressure on the men. On the other hand, I've had juries where the women are just as sexist as the men. I mean, we're dealing with a culture. The culture is sexist. And just because we're women, we're not always immune from the misogyny of our culture. We all
have been indoctrinated with it. You're right. So we should not assume just because they're women. So thank you for that point. So that the jury has to understand. Is she going to put on any kind of a expert psychiatrist or psychologist to talk about this trauma and how often women don't report it right away? Is the judge going to let her do that? Do you know?
I think she is going to do that. And I think that's why they get their psychiatrist.
Okay.
So I think she has the 2 fresh complaint witnesses, the 2 other victims, and a psychological expert. And then I think they're going to show video of Trump's deposition. And hopefully, what that fight will be. E Jean Carroll's lawyers will say you have to have the whole context, which will be a riot because Trump can't answer direct questions. It's going to be madness when they fight over what the completeness doctrine of you can't just show a snippet of a deposition. You have to put it in context. And then I think they're a psychological expert, and I think that's it. So we could be over this Friday.
Oh, yeah, I think we could be, because she said he doesn't have any witnesses except the expert. That witness, I think, to me, is as important as these fact witnesses, because I still think so many people, because the people I overheard on the plane, these are women. They're women as well as men who still don't believe women when they come forward if there's been a lapse in time, if the reporting didn't occur right away. So I think that psychological expert is going to be so important in helping both the 6 men and the 3 women on this jury understand that, like you said, first of all, it wasn't 30 years. It was 5, because after that, there was no coming forward until this law got changed. But that even that 5-year period. And I hope people think back to Donald Trump. That's what I'd remind people. Donald Trump was bigger than life even before he became president. And one of the things his lawyer tried to say, well, you said you were afraid of Donald Trump back then, but now, he's the president, or when you made your complaint, he was president. He was even more powerful. But I don't think that underscores the bigger than life image that Donald Trump has had since he kind of burst into the scene. And I didn't even live in New York at the time. But even folks across the country, his name rings so large and so looms so large that I could see where it would have been intimidating to try to take on someone like that. I mean, he was so good at manipulating the media. I mean, this all didn't happen in 2016. He was doing this for years.
Ask the Central Park 5.
Yes, absolutely. Full-page ad.
Powerful.
Like, kill him. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Very powerful. So I hope that jury can really, I hope they take in what that psychological expert testifies to. But let's talk about the book. So the premise of Donald Trump's defense is this lady is a gold digger. She's here today not because she was raped. She's here because she loves attention. She's here because she's trying to capitalize on this alleged rape to, thrust herself into the limelight, to make money, to sell books, and to, have a payday. Now, that can be a very powerful defense, because a lot of people, again, think that women, are quote unquote gold diggers. We have that, that term oftentimes is used with women. And a lot of people buy into that. How do they combat that?
Well, any woman who writes about experiences where she's abused is then turned into a gold digger. If we describe the abuse women take, then that must be because we're gold diggers. I mean, what are you talking about? Men write memoirs about trauma all the time. Is it only women who aren't allowed to describe what happened to us in our lives? And I think she really credibly did key it into a movement around the world to stop silencing women. I really do love the statement that she said, I was sick of staying silent. I think that's her answer. She didn't make a ton of money on the book, by the way. And it's her experience. She decided to own it. And she decided to own it at 76 years old. I think she's incredibly brave. I really admire her willingness to go through the kind of abuse she has taken for the past week and longer on social media, because the Trump cult is vicious and misogynist and hateful and violent. And she's really brave. And she owns sort of her quirkiness, and she owns the things that people are going to say about waiting, and you wrote a book and you talked about it and you talked to friends and you have friends who don't like Trump. I mean, so what? So what? Is he going to get on the witness stand in front of this jury and be cross-examined? I don't think so.
Yeah, no, it doesn't look like it. By now, we would have heard something from his attorney. But let's talk about the broader Me Too movement. So where do you think the movement is today, and where does a case like this fit into what we've seen over the last, say, 5 years or so with respect to women coming forward, being, unafraid to tell their stories?
I think we're seeing an incredible backlash. It's unbelievable the backlash. If you had told me that we'd be threatened around the country with criminal violations if you try to get health care that you're entitled to, or if you try to use a pill that the FDA approved 20 years ago. I mean, the backlash. There's a state that recently introduced a law that you have to take your husband's last name. I mean, I think women.
Where is that?
I just saw that as I was coming on today, Areva. I'll send it to you.
We'll find that.
They'll find it, yeah.
We don't travel to that state. Oh, my God.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think the backlash of women standing up to powerful interests, to the media being called out for their complicity in the Weinstein cases and the Ailes case and the Cosby case really showed that the media was like, oh, we don't talk about that. We protect the men who are abusive. And the names, it's endless. Matt Lauer, Lev Moonves. I mean, it is an endless stream of powerful men who have abused women for 20, 30, 40, 50 years in Roger Ailes' case. So I think that we're experiencing an incredible backlash against us as women. And we're going to have to stop being silent and just keep fighting. And there are so many brave women doing it.
Are you seeing in your own practice, it seemed like there was this moment, when Me Too was really blowing up where women were coming forward. I had people calling my office left and right, who were willing now to come forward and talk about sexual harassment in a way they hadn't been. But are you seeing women retrench?
I have it in my practice. I think, honestly, young women are less tolerant. They have grown up, more recently, and they just can't believe that they're supposed to accept the stuff that we all put up with and that our mothers and grandmothers and, God forbid, women all around the world, even worse, have put up with. So I do have some hope, which is why voter suppression is so important. I mean, you can see these moves to stop allowing college kids to vote on campus. Yeah. You can see these moves to raise the voting age. I mean, it's a movement that I have confidence in and I believe in, and I think we're going to keep moving forward. But the backlash of when you see all these old white men and these state legislators deciding that we can't get health care that we want, that we are forced into pregnancy. Forced pregnancy is a government interest now. I think that it's all part of the same moment in time.
Real quickly, we're out of time, Nancy, but I do want to ask you this. If Trump wins, if somehow there is a defense verdict, do you think that will have, what impact will that have on the Me Too movement?
I don't like to give it too much import because it is a little bit of a quirky case. But I don't want to think that way. I don't think he's going to win. I don't think he is.
I'm completely fine with us not even putting that into the universe.
All right.
Nancy, thank you so much. We're out of time. What a great conversation. Such great insights and information on this case that we will all be following, and we'll keep you up to date on what happens in the E Jean Carroll versus Donald Trump defamation and sexual assault case. The next voice that you hear will be Robin Ayers right here on KBLA, Talk 1580, and the Raw Report. Stay with us.
If you're not listening to Tavis Smiley weekday mornings on KBLA Talk 1580, you're missing out. Everybody wants to talk to Tavis.
That's one reason, by the way, why I'm so thrilled to have this conversation with you today. The three people I always most hoped would interview me were Phil Donahue, Studs Terkel, and Tavis Smiley. Donahue's retired, Terkel's deceased, so this is a real thrill for me. And the reason why I have such respect for what you do